As his invasion of Ukraine drags toward the end of its fourth year, Vladimir Putin is having to face up to a lot of issues he thought would never become problems. One of those issues is Ukraine's long-range drones and missiles, which are now capable of hitting Moscow, along with plenty of key targets on Russian territory. That would be bad enough for Putin. But at least Russia's president would have been able to tell himself that it's only Ukraine's long-range weapons that he had to focus on. That's not the case anymore, as Sweden has waded into the long-range arena with an announcement that will leave Putin shaking in his boots. This is why Sweden's new weapon terrifies Putin more than NATO. According to Reuters in a November 25th report, the Swedish armed forces have said that the country's government needs to purchase more long-range cruise missiles that will allow Sweden to hit targets deep within another country's territory. Those missiles are intended to serve as a deterrent against attacks on Sweden's territory, claims Swedish Chief of Defence Staff Carl-Johan Edström. Ideally, these weapon systems will also be able to strike targets at a range of up to 2,000 kilometers or around 1,240 miles, with critical infrastructure and military installations falling within Sweden's sights. That range is important. It reveals that there is one country in particular that Sweden is looking to deter with its new long-range cruise missiles: Russia. In its coverage of Edström's report, the Swedish outlet SVT name-checks Russia as the main reason why Sweden wants to get its hands on new cruise missiles. It claims that the Swedish report states, "The military threat from Russia will increase in the coming years," with Edström himself claiming that Sweden's armed forces anticipate that Russia will be able to carry out a large-scale rearmament of itself within the next 2 to 5 years, even after burning through so much of its military stockpiles during the war. SVT adds that Edström's report was created in part as a way to advise Sweden on how it can reach NATO's capability goals, which tie into the idea of creating stronger defenses for NATO's European members against Russian aggression. Reuters also carries a quote from Swedish Defense Minister Paul Jonsson, who told the outlet, "The experience from the war in Ukraine indicates that Russia is vigorously developing its long-range capabilities, both with cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and long-range drones. We must build a stronger deterrent against that threat." That deterrent appears to be Sweden getting its hands on missiles that can travel up to 2,000 kilometers. It's no coincidence that the distance between Moscow and Stockholm is only around half of that proposed range. Sweden wants its new missiles to have enough power to strike Russia's capital with plenty of range to spare if the need arises. However, there is a caveat. In its report on Edström's statements, the Kyiv Post says that Sweden would only use these long-range weapons against Russia if Article 5 of the NATO Charter is triggered. NATO itself describes Article 5 as follows. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty states that an armed attack against one NATO member shall be considered an attack against all members, and triggers an obligation for each member to come to its assistance. That assistance doesn't necessarily have to involve the use of armed force, with each NATO member being able to operate somewhat at its own discretion in terms of providing whatever support and military strength deemed necessary to help the NATO member that is under attack. This is an interesting and fairly clever caveat that Edström has created. Placing Sweden's new missiles, whatever they may be, under the Article 5 banner makes it easier for Sweden and NATO to present the move as defensive rather than aggressive under international law. It's clearly an act of defense, as Article 5 wouldn't have been mentioned otherwise. Sweden is telling Russia that it will have missiles ready if Russia attacks a NATO nation, and those missiles won't be used for any other purpose. Furthermore, the caveat protects Sweden. As a member of NATO itself, Sweden has the power to invoke Article 5 if it's attacked on its own territory. So Putin can't get away with striking Sweden and using the Article 5 caveat as a way to get out of Russia being the victim of a retaliatory Swedish strike. An attack on Sweden is an attack on NATO. Russia would feel the full force of Sweden's missiles in response. But that brings us to the question of what missiles Sweden intends to use as a deterrent against Russia's aggression. Edström's report only suggests that Sweden needs to buy long-range weapon systems, including cruise missiles with a 2,000-kilometer range. It doesn't state what those missiles are or what they could be. Reuters notes that Sweden has already placed an order for German-made Taurus missiles, which can be fired from the country's fleet of Gripen fighter jets. Sweden made that order with the missiles manufacturer Saab. The aviationist adds that the order also seems to include the integration of the Taurus into the Gripen system, which seemingly makes the German missile a frontrunner for Edström's requirements. It's not the only missile system that is being considered, Reuters is quick to add. However, it seems like the most likely contender until Sweden identifies another. Assuming that the Taurus is coming to Sweden, Putin will be very unhappy. The missile has long been rumored to be coming to Ukraine, though Germany has yet to fully commit to providing it. Russia wouldn't want to see that missile enter either Sweden or Ukraine because it has a combination of speed, range, and power that would allow it to devastate many types of Russian targets. Saab, which is one of the manufacturers of Taurus missiles, provides the basics when it comes to the weapon's capabilities. The company describes the Taurus as a precision air-to-surface missile system that is perfect for extremely demanding air operations. Taurus can destroy many types of targets, including hardened, deep, and dense facilities of all shapes and sizes. While this is marketing speak designed to sell as many of the missiles as possible, the Taurus's specifications indicate that it is up to many of the jobs that Saab claims it can do. The Taurus is the only standoff missile that is so accurate that it can be programmed to strike a specific floor of a building. Saab also claims that the missile can easily penetrate air defenses, though this is difficult to confirm as there is no evidence that the Taurus has been combat tested, never mind tested against the sorts of air defenses that Russia fields. The missile has been in service since 2005, however, and Germany will have tested it outside of combat, presumably to confirm these air defense claims. Boosting the air defense-resistant claim is the fact that Taurus contains a navigation system that combines inertial measurement unit navigation with GPS and an image-based terrain mapping system. This trio combines to enable Taurus to fly toward its target at a low altitude, making the missile difficult for air defense radars to track and even harder for air defense missiles to hit. At its lowest, the Taurus can travel just 50 meters or around 164 feet from the ground. However, the highlight of the Taurus missile and the reason why Saab claims it's a great choice for dealing with hardened targets is that it has a tandem warhead named Mephisto. Weighing 481 kilograms, which is roughly 1,060 pounds, that warhead is very different from the warheads that are typically packed into long-range cruise missiles. The Financial Times explained how in a 2024 article where it said that the Mephisto is an intelligent warhead system that penetrates deep into a target before it explodes. The fuse system that detonates the warhead can also be programmed only to activate when the warhead has reached a specific part of a target, such as a certain floor of a building, or after the missile has broken through a hardened surface. The idea is to maximize the damage caused to a structure, rendering that structure unusable. Fabian Hoffmann, who was a missile technology doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo at the time of the Financial Times report, explains why this is so important. Taurus has a higher kill probability because its superior fuse system allows its warhead to destroy complex structures such as bridges, with greater likelihood compared with Storm Shadow's Scalp EG, Hoffmann claims. Combine that with a turbofan engine and you get a weapon that also offers improved range over the Storm Shadow. However, range is also an issue that may mean the Taurus isn't the ideal weapon that Edstrom is looking for. Saab says this powerful missile only has a range of about 500 kilometers or 310 miles. That's fairly impressive, however 500 kilometers is not even half the distance from Stockholm to Moscow, and it's a long way from the 2,000-kilometer deterrence that Edstrom claims that Sweden needs. Taurus is far from useless as a deterrent, despite these range issues. As an air-to-surface missile, Taurus is fired from a fighter jet, meaning Sweden has the option of deploying jets over the Baltic Sea and using Taurus to strike targets inside Russia. However, the missile may not be able to reach Moscow, at least not reliably, unless it's deployed from within Russian airspace. On the plus side, training in the use of Taurus can be completed in about 12 weeks, the Financial Times claims that leaked calls between German officers have revealed. The real issue for Sweden is integrating the missile into its aerial platforms, and that's an issue that Sweden is working on as we speak. Still, we can't get away from the fact that the one missile that Reuters mentioned in its report on Edstrom's statements doesn't have the range that Edstrom says Sweden's new missile needs to have. So what does? Unfortunately, that's a question that's difficult to answer, as Edstrom gives no indication of whether a missile that fits his billing is being built in Sweden or not. America's Tomahawk cruise missiles come close, with a range of 1,600 kilometers or around 1,000 miles. However, there's no evidence that Sweden is attempting to purchase these missiles, and its Gripens also don't appear to be capable of firing them in their current configuration. If the missile hasn't been determined, with only the Taurus seeming a likely contender, then the question has to be asked, why would Putin be so terrified of what Sweden plans to do? It's not so much the missile itself that scares Putin, whatever that missile may end up being. Rather, it's the prospect of a NATO-aligned nation that is so close to Russia's borders having such a missile that will give Putin the shivers. Russia's president had long been wary of Sweden joining NATO, even years before the country gave up on its neutrality to become a member of the Collective Defense Organization. So worried was Putin that Russia unleashed volleys of threats against Sweden, along with Finland, when rumors first started swirling that Sweden was going to be fast-tracked through the NATO membership process as a response to Putin's Ukraine invasion. Back in April 2022, the BBC reported that Russia had shot a warning at Sweden, telling the country that it should back away from NATO membership because the move wouldn't bring stability to Europe. Putin didn't deliver his threat himself, of course. Instead, he spoke through his favored mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, who claimed that the alliance remains a tool geared towards confrontation when speaking about NATO. Peskov added that NATO is not the kind of alliance which ensures peace and stability, and its further expansion will not bring additional security to the European continent, before concluding that Russia would have to rebalance the situation if Sweden joined NATO. Of course, all of these threats ignore the fact that Russia created the imbalance in Europe with the Ukraine invasion. But when has the truth ever stopped a Russian propagandist from creating an alternate version of events? A couple of months later, toward the end of June, Putin tried to backtrack from these warnings as it became clear that Sweden was still going to join NATO. We do not have such problems with Sweden and Finland, which unfortunately we have with Ukraine. We have no territorial issues, no disputes. We have nothing that could bother us from the point of view of Finland or Sweden's membership in NATO, Russia's president said during a news conference in Turkmenistan at the end of June. That's a far cry from the kinds of statements that came out of Peskov's mouth the previous April, though Putin soon showed just how unbothered he was about the whole affair by issuing another warning to Sweden. If military contingents and military infrastructure were deployed there, we would be obliged to respond symmetrically and raise the same threats for those territories where threats have arisen for us, Putin added right after claiming that Sweden and Finland can do whatever they want. So Putin was saying that Sweden could join NATO and parade around as a member as much as it wanted, but if Sweden actually tried to participate in NATO operations, as it naturally would as a member of NATO, then Russia would have to respond. We'd call that a masterclass in Russian double-speak if it wasn't so blatantly obvious that Putin still had a huge problem with Sweden's decision. Putin was worried about Sweden way back in 2022. He became terrified when Sweden became an official NATO member, and Russia's leader should feel this way for a few reasons. We touched on one of them earlier in that Sweden's NATO membership also brings it under the banner of the Article 5 NATO Charter, where before Sweden could represent a manageable risk as it would have to fight alone if Russia attacked. Now it's become a country with the backing of 31 other NATO members that will jump to Sweden's defense if Putin strikes. Perhaps Edström's mention of only using Sweden's new missiles if Article 5 is triggered is less a caveat and more of a warning to Putin. It could be the Swedes' way of warning Russia's leader that Russia faces the full might of NATO if he attacks Sweden, and the missiles fired toward Moscow from Stockholm would just be the starting point. Another reason why Sweden's making any sort of military move worries Putin is that Sweden is a relatively strong country that is far too close to Russia for Putin's comfort. Though Sweden and Russia don't share a land border, Sweden does have an extensive border leading out into the Baltic Sea, which is the only waterway that separates Sweden from Russia. Sweden is also allied to Finland, Estonia, and Latvia via those nations' NATO memberships. All three border Russia, and all can be reached via the Baltic Sea. So Sweden getting new missiles that can hit Moscow isn't just a concern because those missiles could be launched from Stockholm. Putin will be worried because a Swedish stockpile of long-range missiles could also be forward-deployed or shared with those close NATO partners such as Finland, allowing Allied forces to strike much deeper into Western Russia if Article 5 is triggered. Even the Taurus missiles, which have a range of about 500 kilometers, roughly a quarter of the 2,000-kilometer reach Sweden is now talking about, could threaten key military sites in northwest Russia if launched from bases in eastern Finland. They still would not be able to hit Moscow, however. Helsinki lies about 890 kilometers, or around 550 miles from the Russian capital, so a 500-kilometer standoff weapon falls well short. What such deployments would do is shorten the distance to many other strategic targets near the Finnish-Russian border, while a future 2,000-kilometer class missile would finally bring Moscow itself into comfortable range. Putin's many warnings to Sweden about its NATO membership ultimately come down to this type of cooperation. Russia's president knows that Sweden's building a stockpile of long-range cruise missiles essentially means that other NATO nations, which are even closer to Russia and may be in Putin's sights before Sweden, also gain access to those missiles. At the very least, Sweden would fly into those nations using Gripens loaded with its new missiles if Article 5 were triggered. These are the practical reasons that Putin is terrified of Sweden's latest move. However, there's another reason why Putin is scared. Sweden isn't just talking the talk, as it's been preparing for a potential fight with Russia since Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. There's a mindset issue at play here that's almost as damaging to Putin's ambitions as Sweden becoming a member of NATO. As far back as January 2024, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs was reporting on Sweden telling its citizens that they must prepare for war, with the obvious antagonist being Russia. The former commander-in-chief of the Swedish military, Mikael Biden, delivered the stark warning in January, stating, "Russia's war against Ukraine is just a step, not an end game." The delivery of that message was criticized by some Swedish politicians as being abrupt and divisive. But the spirit of the message was simple: Swedes need to be prepared for a fight. Over a year later, in March 2025, the Swedish National Security Service, SAPO, claimed that the Russian threat against Sweden was growing. The BBC reported on the group claiming that incidents of hybrid warfare and violent extremism fueled by Russia were on the rise, leading the SAPO head Charlotte von Essen to warn that Sweden faced a tangible risk that the security situation can deteriorate further. She warned that Sweden needs to be vigilant about the spread of anti-state narratives and conspiracy theories, as Russia worked to destabilize a nation that Putin has tried to claim could do whatever it wants when it comes to its own defense. Clearly, Russia's president doesn't think that. Sweden recognizes what Russia is doing, and though it would be inaccurate to claim that Sweden is on some sort of war footing, there is a growing mindset within the country that it needs to be prepared for a fight. Putin doesn't want that kind of mindset to spread, as he would much prefer Sweden to be caught unawares. If long-range cruise missiles capable of reaching Moscow do enter Sweden, Putin will know that the country is far more alert and far more capable than he wants it to be. Ultimately, Edström's report states what Sweden should be doing rather than putting his suggestions into action. But that alone is enough to scare Putin, especially as Sweden undergoes a transformation that makes it one of the NATO members that represent an immediate threat to the Russian leader's plans for European expansion. But maybe it's not Sweden's upcoming long-range weapons that should be on Putin's mind. Ukraine is still actively developing long-range drones, and it's found a new use for one of them. In a world first, Ukraine has managed to shoot down a Russian helicopter with a long-range drone inside Russian territory. Find out how Ukraine pulled off the impossible in our video. And remember to subscribe to the Military Show if you want to see more coverage of how European nations are preparing for a war with Russia. And thank you for watching.